Hi, good evening, and thank you for being here tonight. Welcome to the inaugural event of the first 100 Days, a college-wide initiative combining civics and public media. I have the distinct pleasure of co-leading the 100 Days initiative at Bard alongside Erin Canan, Vice President of Student Affairs, and Danielle Rio, Associate Director of the Human Rights Project at Bard. This is an initiative, yay. This is an initiative rooted in the belief that the values of justice, fairness, diversity, and inclusion, hallmarks of a Bard education, comprise the fabric of democratic citizenship. The aim of the initiative is to encourage citizens at Bard and beyond to investigate the policies of the new administration thoroughly, inform others, and engage in thoughtful civic action. Bard is a place to think, but it is also a place of historic, thoughtful action. Bard has acted to protect the marginalized and the vulnerable. In a recent letter to the Bard community, President Botstein reminded us of this when he wrote, "Bard has a long and proud history as a haven for refugees, first in the 1930s and again after the failed Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Tonight, I ask you to consider helping Bard uphold this commitment by donating to the Sanctuary Fund, designed to provide educational access to undocumented and refugee students. The postcard in your hand and the link on the webcast provide more information on how to do so. And I thank you very, very much for considering this. We are fortunate to have an opportunity to begin the collective work of the 100 Days and beyond by hearing our two distinguished speakers discuss Trump abroad, Trump at home, declaring the new war. Please welcome Leon Botstein, President and Leon Levy Professor in the Arts and Humanities of Bard College, and Mark Danner, writer, journalist, and professor, who most recently has covered the Trump campaign and now the Trump presidency for the New York Review. His new book is Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War. Danner is the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College. Thank you again for being here tonight, and I hope you enjoy tonight's discussion.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to this discussion and want to thank you all for coming. Mark Danner and I will talk for a while, and then we will turn the floor over to questions. And there's, I think, a revolving mic on both sides of the auditorium, and so that we'll have time for people to make comments and ask questions. And so without further ado, I'll turn to Mark, who I believe has written extensively since the election, and also was at the inauguration, and also at the march the day after, to start the conversation. Mark.
Thank you, Leon. Hello, everybody. How are you feeling today? I was saying to Leon just now that there's a great deal of political anxiety afoot to make a very obvious observation. It reminds me of the Milan Kundera novels we used to read about occupied Czechoslovakia in the 70s and 80s. People are anxious, people are checking the news feeds every hour or so. I'm very happy that we're here for this discussion, because one of the best things we can do is talk about our life as citizens and what's happening to our polity. And it seems like a particularly good time to do it now, 6 months into the Trump administration. It's not 6 months into the Trump administration, is it? Let me see. Leon is right. I did attend the inauguration, and if I'm not mistaken, that was 2 weeks ago tomorrow. And there were a lot of people there, I can tell you that, a lot of people. No, it's a remarkable thing. I attended the Obama inauguration 8 years ago, and the idea that the numbers were in any way similar is completely crazy, completely crazy. And I was struck a few days ago, a little more than that, when President Trump mentioned how he started to speak and people were worried that there was going to be rain, but a couple drops fell and then it stopped and then the sun came out. And I was struck by this because, in fact, the sun never emerged on Inauguration Day, and with eerie, as I told my wife Michelle on the phone afterwards, with a kind of eerie echo effect from nature, the moment that Donald Trump started to speak, the moment he started, I mean, literally the second of his first words in his speech, the rain started to fall. It was quite eerie, and people looked at one another, you know, and raised their eyebrows at this coincidence. And it rained throughout his inauguration, his dark inauguration speech, something which he seems to have missed. That leads me to my first point, which is that people who expected and have expected for 18 months that the office will change Donald Trump, the nomination will change Donald Trump, the election will change Donald Trump, the presidency will change Donald Trump, should know by now that he will change the office. The office will not change him. And I think this is an important thing to remember, because there is a longing after normalcy that is just bound to be frustrated. I saw CNN just before I left my house this evening, and he was saying, the world is terribly, this was at a prayer breakfast today, the world is terribly screwed up, everybody, but we're going to fix it. That's what I do. I fix things. Now, the idea that the President of the United States would say this as a public statement is, of course, completely insane, unprecedented, but we're getting used to these kinds of proclamations, and we're getting used to the fact that he does his own diplomacy on the phone, fights with the Prime Minister of Australia, of all things, fights with the President of Mexico, threatens Iran, seems to do it all without any planning. This is him. And I think it is unlikely that he will change. And I think it is important, it seems to me, to recognize that fact and to no longer hope that something different will come along. Having said that, we've seen a flurry of executive orders, which would be my second point, that he is doing what he said he would do during the campaign. I think nothing that he has done, certainly by executive order, differs from what he vowed to do during the campaign, and that includes the Muslim ban. You know, this means that many of these actions, while they are shocking, should not be surprising. And perhaps we should take some sustenance from that. That is, if we look at his peculiar ideology and his views, many of which go back decades, his distrust of world trade, his need, thinking that we need a strong man, his support of strong police action, the idea of sending the feds into Chicago, for example. These things go way back in his history. You can look at the ads that he published in the New York Times in the late 80s, in which these views are embedded. He still holds them. They are impervious to facts. They are impervious to argument. He intends to act on them, and he indeed is doing that. Now, how is he acting? I think this is a third very important point, that the top officials of the administration, which are people who are very personally close to him, Steve Bannon, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, Kellyanne Conway, a handful of other people, not even a handful of other people, those are basically the main people, are forming a kind of cabal and are essentially circumventing the agencies that are equipped by law are responsible for carrying out certain decisions. So he's essentially circumventing large chunks of the government. Now you could say, well, he's doing that because many of his people aren't in place. Possibly that's true, but I would suspect that this is the way he will be governing. And there's a similarity in recent history, and that is what Cheney, Vice President Cheney, did under the Bush administration in the wake of September 11th. They formed a very small cabal. They essentially circumvented the interagency process in the national security bureaucracies, put through policies on torture, policies on military commissions, and so on, and were able to essentially avoid opposition within the government, within the professional government and the appointed government, by keeping the decisions very, very close to the vest, using secrecy, using a very small number of people. So they've been able to achieve a great deal in a short amount of time. Why else have they been able to achieve a great deal? And this it seems to me, we get to the point about what is happening, it seems to me, is we're seeing arise what might be called a soft autocracy. A soft autocracy. And this is not only the fact that he's concentrating personal power in his own hands, but the fact that the countervailing institutions of American government are being undermined, in some cases by themselves. We could talk about the courts in a minute, I guess, but what I have in mind is the Congress. The Republican Congress is very dubious about him, but in general sees its chance. It has recognized that the Republicans are unable to win the popular vote nationally, and sees the chance, via the vehicle of Donald Trump, to put their long-held policies into action. So the main countervailing power in a situation like this that the founders envisaged would be the Congress, the first power, the main power, the legislative power. And in fact, the legislative power, the Congress, will not oppose him, it's my prediction anyway, unless he gets us into a war or does something even more untoward than he has already done, and you can let your imaginations work on that. So Congress, out of its own self-interest and out of the world of polarized politics that we've been in for the last 20-odd years, will essentially let him have his way. He will do embarrassing things. He will get into embarrassing arguments. People like John McCain will be embarrassed and call up the Australian ambassador to try to clean up Donald Trump's mess. But I think on very large policies, they probably will not oppose him. Secondly, the courts, which have opposed the Muslim ban, which have stayed it, and some 3 judges have, I believe, at this point, are showing some spine, some backbone, but it's yet to be seen whether, if he goes from a shatterer of norms, which is what he is now, to a breaker of laws, which may well be possible in the very near future, it's yet to be seen whether the courts will have the backbone to stand up for him. It depends on what issue we're talking about. It may, if it has to do with an issue of war and peace, of, for example, the permanent war that's being fought that he put his brand on this weekend with a special forces raid in Yemen, I think it's very unlikely that the courts will show any backbone in standing up for him. Let's see, I would like to add something positive. What can I add that's positive? Do you think this is a little too negative, my analysis? I guess let me say one positive thing before I conclude these opening remarks. That is, the day after the inauguration, I attended the Women's March on Washington. I desperately wanted to acquire one of those pink pussy hats, and I wasn't able to. It's a measure of the size of the crowd that they were completely taken. Apparently there's a nationwide shortage of pink wool. I don't know whether that's an apocryphal story or not. But I want to draw attention to that march and to the spontaneous demonstrations at airports And finally, to Donald Trump's low approval numbers, which now stand between 35 and 40%, depending on the polls. This is absolutely historically unprecedented during the polling era. There has never been a president who has entered office with a majority of the country disapproving of their policies, and after 2 weeks, essentially 2/3 of the country disapproving. The marches, the large number of people showing up, and his low approval numbers perhaps suggest cracks in his legislative support, certainly suggest that there will be a continuing opposition, and which may eventuate in a surprising election in 2 years, conceivably. There's a lot more to discuss than that, needless to say, but I didn't want to leave on a completely negative note.
So let me start by saying that I did not really think very carefully about what it would be like to have Donald Trump as president, and not because I was lazy about it, but I had the wrong intuitive feeling that it wasn't plausible, largely because Donald Trump is, in the history of the United States, has nothing to do with his views. It has to do with the fact that he is the least prepared person to be president of the United States and does not have the temperament. And that temperament is a temperament, he's not a person you can reason with. I agree completely with Mark. He's a person who's not really interested in learning anything new or encountering circumstances that he needs to grasp. This is clearly a very difficult job, and to reconcile rhetoric as a campaigner with actually governing is difficult business, and every president has encountered it. He's incapable of concentrating. He's incapable of hearing something that he doesn't agree with. He's incapable of thinking in any sustained way, which is why his sentences are so short and his rhetoric so ultimately vulgar and simplistic. Most of his rhetoric is negative, is childish. He's going to destroy the Johnson Amendment. He's going to undo this. He's going to stop that. It's all negative in a vision of the world where he is a kind of, and this is very narcissistic, a kind of personal rescuer. It's an undisciplined behavior of a bad Roman emperor, and it is. It's not a situation where you can reason with him or engage in the art of compromise. So there is something startling. I'm startled. I'm startled by the lack of regard for the office and for the power it holds, and for the responsibility, no matter what one's point of view may be. The second thing is that he has no regard for the clear distinction between what is truth and what is not truth, between what is a lie and what is not a lie, and what is a hypothesis which is yet to be proved. Many years ago, the philosopher Hannah Arendt spoke about the threat of the defactualization of politics. And suddenly you talk about politics in a world that is not what it is. It's not the reality, but it's your imagined space. In that sense, the reality TV show is a reasonable way of thinking about it. It isn't actually what it is. It presumes to be reality. It isn't. And there is no doubt that in the 20th century, this defactualization has come along with authoritarian regimes. And this was a hallmark of fascism in the 20s. It's also a hallmark of Stalinism, in which the government and its leaders asserted things that were plainly not true. Stalin supported a form of biology under Lysenko against Mendelian genetics, which is clearly wrong, stuck to it. The Nazis refused to accept relativistic physics as being a Jewish science. They believed in a theory of race, which they covered up with an apparatus of scientific explanation. So by politicizing radically, ideologically, the conduct of real investigation and evidence and truthfulness. So trivial as it sounds about saying whether there were so many people at the inauguration or not, or whether or not 5 million illegal people voted in the election, therefore making the popular vote a wrong thing to mention, not to concede that it's perfectly legal to have become president of the United States without winning the popular vote. He's not the first person to do so. But this kind of thing, which seems trivial, is deeply rooted and is extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous because we don't really understand how to deal with someone who creates a world of alternative facts, and the journalistic conventions allow us to dress it up as if they were a real debate. So it's as if someone were to say, well, the earth is flat. And so that's an alternative point of view, deserves to be heard. In some sense, emotionally, yes. It just happens to be false. And that distinction is one which is crucial both to freedom and democracy. So given the personality, this narcissistic personality who is absolutely incapable of learning something new or admitting error, and also who is not concerned with the way the world is, but has this very single-minded, often half-baked ideas about how things actually work. For example, in the Muslim ban, the countries from which terrorists in the United States actually came from were not on the list. The suspicion, of course, is that he has economic interests in Saudi Arabia. That's why Saudi Arabia was on the list. It wasn't even coherent. But they don't care because they feel they're able to communicate to a part of the public that accepts that fact. They share, as people did race theory or false genetics or not believing in evolution. Facts are difficult and they're often inconvenient. So there is something unprecedented going on. But I'm reasonably optimistic on several accounts. First of all, history has no example of a dictatorship being established by a 70-year-old. There is no, so time is on our side. That if you look at the revolutionaries in the French Revolution, the radical phase, if you look at the fascists of the 20s, you look at the Bolsheviks of 1918-19, they're all relatively young people. Second is that his organization, his narcissism is lifelong, which means he doesn't come with an organization really. It is, he has a core constituency, but that's it's cobbled together, and it doesn't have, thank God, yet a paramilitary arm. So I think our anxiety, which is genuine, is legitimate. Our alarm is legitimate. But the fact that he doesn't have that kind of apparatus, black shirts or brown shirts, or a really well-organized over many years political apparatus behind him, should not allow us to take this lightly. In my own opinion, the optimism lies a little bit where Mark put it. The demonstrations are fine, but this is going to be hard work of continuous opposition. We cannot be bored. We cannot ultimately be exhausted early in this fight. This fight has to be consistent, and one other point I want to make, it has to be consistent and has to be on the local level. even on immigration. I'm heartened by the behavior of the state of California. I'm heartened by this state, by those cities, even this town of Red Hook, can then stand up in the courts and assert its rights about who lives here and who comes here. That the states, that now localities and states can assert what once was the province of the reactionary segregationist right, which was states' rights. This is a federal republic. This is not a unified national republic, and we have the right to stand up for what in our local communities we regard to be the proper use, and given of the laws and of our freedoms. And I believe finally that Mark is also right. In the end of the day, if we speak out intelligently, consistently, forcefully, we don't give in to the stereotypes of the opposition, not willing to hear the other person talk. We have to learn how to talk to his supporters with empathy on the ground, because he's not going to bring them work back. He's not going to bring them more health insurance. He's not going to bring them a better life. He's not going to provide them with the things he argued. And he may distract his failure by creating crises which give him more autocracy. We have to do several things at once, which is to oppose him openly, consistently, democratically, and with an unrelenting sense of mission, because all is not yet lost.
That was your positive. Well, there's much in there that I very much profoundly agree with. I think that the war on fact, or the politicization of fact, might be a better way to put it, is something that should be underlined and emphasized and discussed and analyzed and pointed out again and again, particularly in colleges and universities, particularly by the news media, which is, in a sense, the subject of the war on fact, the politicization of fact. The idea that if what Breitbart says is questionable, well, what the New York Times says is questionable. That the numbers out on the mall from the Times are going to be one number, and from another publication are going to be a different number, and the difference is going to be the political belief of who's reporting, and that there is no unquestionable fact. When I waited at a rally just before Election Day in Pittsburgh for Trump, a huge rally in an aircraft hangar, which I wrote about for the New York Review of Books, it was fascinating hearing in the crowd people talking about the polls, which were then showing Hillary Clinton up by 2 to 3% nationally. They're all bullshit. They're all bullshit, people said. You know, it's like everything the elite media says. And of course, the election seems to affirm that point, even though, in fact, Hillary Clinton did win by 2% nationally. And the polls nationwide, speaking, were correct. But I think the war on fact is extremely important, and I think we should point out that Trump is simply the aficionado or the master of this war on fact, that we've had this come up before. Wonderful book that I recommend to everyone here is Daniel Borsten's The Image, in which the term pseudo-event is coined. That book was published in the early 60s. Remarkable book. George W. Bush, of course, his close political aide, Karl Rove, his Steve Bannon, as it were, said that, called reporters people from the reality-based community, and that, in fact, reality doesn't matter anymore because we're an empire now, and we act and we change reality, and by the time you report reality, as you're supposed to do, by that time, we as an empire will have changed that reality. I mean, he had an actual theory of the undermining of fact that he set out very directly to a reporter for the New York Times, Ron Suskind. So we've had this theme before. We've also, I think Leon's completely right to point to Stalin, to point to Nazi Germany, and also, of course, Eastern Europe. I mean, I'd mention again the novels of Kundera and various other novelists from the so-called other Europe, as Philip Roth used to call it. There's a kind of lesson in what we're starting to go through now. Let me make one point, which is that Leon made a point about being in this for the long game and not being exhausted. And I think it's important to say that Donald Trump is a frenetic character who wins his battles in part by being everywhere at once, by seeming to create one controversy, a new controversy before the preceding one has run out of gas. He masters the news cycle. He exhausts people in the audience. If you look back now, that's why I said at the beginning, goodness, 6 months into the Trump administration, because it, of course, seems that long. And if we look at the various controversies we've been through in the last 2 weeks, it's quite remarkable. You know, crowd size, the CIA speech, the Muslim ban is only the latest of a number. And of course, now Trump offered to send the army into Mexico. I don't know if all of you have seen the nightly news. So these things will continue, and this is part of the way he governs. He masters the news cycle, and he also plays the commercial press. Extremely important point, that he realizes that we have this odd chimera in our press, which has a public function. You know, it's in the First Amendment, it's protected, but at the same time, they're commercial enterprises that depend on ratings. And this contradiction, because it is a contradiction, between making decisions for editorial reasons and making them for ratings reasons, was the reason that we have Donald Trump as president. He was able to ride that contradiction through the primaries by gaining absolutely free news coverage. And of course, he doesn't need free news coverage now, but he is still manipulating the press and manipulating the polity in the same way. However, at the end of all this, I have to say that his numbers going down, the lack of approval for what he's doing, suggests perhaps not only skepticism about his policies and their cruelty. I think there's something very basic about some of them that particularly the Muslim ban, that is a kind of cruelty that most Americans are repelled by. I think those numbers going down suggest that there will be a kind of fatigue that won't serve him well.
No. As long as we don't completely alienate what I would call the demonize the innocent base that voted for him, and however much we may disagree with them, I think we do have the majority of the American people behind us. I also want to skirt the press issue because I do hold them responsible. You're absolutely right. The commercialization, he makes good copy. And he does follow...
He makes money.
And yes, and he really is a modern media invention because he isn't, in a way. He is... the other thing, of course, he does, without knowing it, takes a playbook out of other authoritarian regimes, which is to change the focus of attention. To keep, it's like a game in which the opposition is moving all around the court as he controls the ball in different directions to disarm them or defeat them. The one thing that I think is also optimistic is that one fear would be that there would be this tidal wave continuing of authoritarian regimes. So Putin was in Hungary today, and the question of Marine Le Pen, but Theresa May didn't do herself any favors in her appearance in her home base. In Washington, that the chance that Trump will become a pariah for Donald Tusk on behalf of the European Union to list America for the first time in the post-war period as an enemy of Europe, as a threat to Europe, the alienation of allies, seems to indicate that he will be faced with events that show that he does not govern. This is not a person who can govern. So the question then falls, as you suggested, when there's a crisis, how he manipulates that crisis that he doesn't generate, that's generated around the world. What worries me, of course, is the circle of people around him. So if you look at the entire cabinet, there are one or two plausible people. That is, say, people with some evident expertise and maturity, people I don't agree with, but who've actually run responsible lives. And then you have people like Bannon, who is much worse than Dick Cheney. And Kellyanne Conway, who is simply a kind of a strangely effective person who recasts effectively to the base lies as truth, kind of a strange manipulative force. Who else is in that inner circle? There's not an individual in that inner circle who gives confidence. So the question is, who's going to be in charge? I mean, this is not when something really goes wrong, something exogenous, or even internally, if in fact the economic brief of blip of optimism fades, and there is something in the order of a recession, or rising unemployment again, or there is in the trade wars that he's threatening to start. The other optimistic thing, I would not believe that I'm saying this, but the very big economic forces. Autocracy historically has succeeded when the concentration of wealth has backed that aristocracy. For all the charisma of Mussolini, all the charisma of Hitler, if it were not for the industrial underpinnings of both nations and the finance communities backing those leaders, they would not have gained control. But you can see from the behavior of Jeff Bezos or Sergey Brin going to the San Francisco airport, the big multinational corporations which dominate our landscape, Amazon, Google, Apple, they have nothing to gain from the economic policies that he's putting forward. This kind of nativist, nationalist, old-fashioned notion of what the economy ought to be like. And so my hope is that that fissure increases, the fissure between the true concentration of industrial economic wealth and his posturing.
Well, I think, to me, the most frightening point you raise is about a crisis. And I've thought, since I first started writing about Trump, that if I were one of these guys sitting in Raqqa in Syria, at the headquarters of the Islamic State, he is a dream come true. I mean, their concern is to what they call eliminate the gray zone, which is to say they want to increase the intensity of the conflict between Muslims and non-Muslims. And that means within societies creating anti-Muslim fervor, making Muslims within Western societies, including the United States, feel alienated, feel repressed, become candidates for radicalization. And Donald Trump is just a wet dream, you'll forgive the expression, for them. But and I think, well, let me finish. I've thought from the beginning that the greatest risk was that they would design a terrorist attack on American soil that would be intended to lead to a radical reaction, carpet bombing Raqqa, committing some kind of war crime that he's talked about repeatedly, of course, whether it's torture or killing the families of terrorists. there's a whole list that you can come out with. All of those things, and including simply trying to eradicate ISIS from the face of the earth, which he said in his inaugural, using carpet bombing or whatever, would be an enormous boon to the Islamic State and to jihadists generally. So they have a very strong incentive in causing a crisis. The second thing is that we're in this fascinating position where for 70 years, Republicans, Democrats, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, JFK, you name it, have agreed on the basic lineaments of American foreign policy, which depends on an open trading system, American hegemony over shipping lanes, the American alliance system, NATO, the alliance with Japan, the alliance with Korea, so the Atlantic and the Pacific alliance systems. And these are the things that Donald Trump essentially wants to destroy. And this is unprecedented. We simply haven't had a leader during the superpower era of the United States, which goes back beyond the living memory of just about everybody. We haven't had a leader who wants to destroy, in effect, destroy that system. He believes that trade, the so-called wise men who set up this system in the late 40s believed that open trade was an institution that would enormously bolster the power of the United States. He believes that we've been, to use his eloquent expression, suckers, that we've been taken advantage of by the world during that entire period. It's a very odd view of history shared by maybe Robert Taft, maybe Lindbergh. I mean, there are a few. It's very, very unusual. He's very much an outlier, and we simply don't know what's going to happen if he wants to, for example, pull apart the European Union. So the kind of crises you're talking about, I also think, to go back to the points about businesses, that there are a lot of businesses, indeed, who will not see this in their self-interest. That's absolutely true, although there's some who will take the tax cuts and be happy with them. And we'll start to see the difference in that. We already are seeing it right now. Yeah.
So I agree. I think that there are several things to consider on the economic side. First of all, this big system, which there's something appealing about his attacking a kind of status quo, which was actually not totally fair. And his predecessors failed to address the transformation of the American economy and helping those people who were displaced. There was kind of callous disregard and a callous, too much Robert Rubin in the White House. Of course, that's ironic because all the people around him are billionaires from the same place, from Goldman Sachs. There's nothing really populist about it. That's the other big lie, that he's not actually going back to a kind of empowering of people who were left out of the transformation of the economy. But on the optimistic side, I was reflecting that I don't think we can expect a love fest between Putin and Trump. I think this is an utter illusion.
Such a beautiful image.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. I think they are very pleased that they've made fun of the Americans, that they've humiliated the Americans in some way. But I don't think they think that there is a common interest. And certainly Putin is not constructive in the anti-terrorist attempt. The other thing is that there's going to be a reaction in Europe against this kind of authoritarianism. Trump actually, I think, this is an odd prediction, has every chance of rescuing Angela Merkel and of strengthening the opposition in England and sinking the candidacy of Marine Le Pen. That the Europeans, when they see what's going on in America and they're horrified by the behavior of Trump, are not going to elect a Trump in their own backyard. They'll take not a pro-American but an anti-American stance. You'll see a growth of anti-Americanism, and that anti-Americanism may not play into the hands of the right wing. But that's a prediction. I worry, of course, very much. What my own focus is on preserving the the openness of the United States and the openness of the United States as an immigrant nation and also as a destination point, particularly in our universities and colleges as a place of international exchange. The sort of damage to America's standing. But the treatment of Mexico, so I understand that one can make an argument that that America has, I don't think it's a good argument, but not sort of been well treated by the Europeans, especially in the Australian case. The Australians have been our allies and have fought by side with us since the Second World War, and it's just senseless to do what he did, except for a theatrical purpose. But I think that we need to realize that if a crisis does occur, the thing that I worry about is that as an excuse to limit civil liberties and to justify a kind of domestic restriction, much worse than the Patriot Act.
I think that will, I think that absolutely will happen. I mean, we haven't talked about this, but Trump comes to power at a time of permanent war. He has two authorizations for the use of military force. The first one after the war, after the attacks of September 11th. The second one about Iraq. There are wars going on now with American forces in 6 countries in the Middle East and South Asia. And it seems to me that if there is a domestic attack, for example, you will have a lot of, he will take extreme action. In a sense, he will have to, because he has said, I am the strong man. I am the man who's going to protect you. I am going to close this country off from the threatening Arabs. I will not let them in. And during the time of Barack Obama, the 8 years of Barack Obama, fewer than 100 Americans have died in the United States in terrorist attacks. And that's, almost all of those are quite recent, with San Bernardino and Orlando. This threat is enormously exaggerated, but it has been such an important part of the constellation of his politics that in the wake of a successful attack, I think there will be severe restrictions on civil liberties in this country. And I think he will impose these restrictions gratefully and with a flourish, and the Republican Congress will support them. Let me go back to something else you said, Leon.
Which is why, before you leave that point, which is why our standing up now, before there is a crisis, and being vocally in opposition, and vocally on the record as anticipating this, will serve us in good stead.
I hope
not to be taken by surprise, and not to be silent.
I agree that that is the only thing to do. I don't agree necessarily that it will serve us in good stead, simply because I think he will be, in a funny way, his entire politics are shaped for that moment.
Yes, but
the day after the attack.
But Mark, you have to say, I was heartened by the spontaneous response to the immigration ban.
Yeah.
Those demonstrations in New York and San Francisco definitely will have an impact on the courts, not on him, on the very weak-kneed and cowardly representatives we have on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, from sort of cowering. The power of the presidency is enormous. What he did to Berkeley, for example, was threaten no federal funds. So he's the president of the United States, so he, with a cudgel, tries to beat down opposition. But the appearance of large support against what he did, we have to provide some measure of courage
I agree.
to the opposition.
I agree entirely with what you just said. I'm just saying that I think in the wake of an attack, this will be the moment when he will put into place measures that will be if not broadly supported, will not be opposed in the same way that they were in the fall of 2001. And he is in the position, you know, we're in this weird position in the politics of national security, or the politics of insecurity, if we could call them that, around terrorism, where a politician has to take action in the wake of an attack, even if the actions he's taking would in no way have prevented that attack. That was true after 9/11, when that attack could have been prevented by the laws on the books. There didn't need to be many of the new laws they drafted. But that will be his position too, that the reason that this attack succeeded was not because of I did not succeed in executing the laws on the books effectively. It's because we need better, stronger, tougher laws. I have to, you know, it's one of his favorite words in his very small vocabulary is tough, tough, tough. And by the way, about that vocabulary, it's very effective. They've said, you know, an analysis, I think it was Google who did the analysis, said that he speaks at a fourth grade with a fourth grade vocabulary. They analyzed all the Republican candidates, and his was by far the lowest. But it's, having gone to a number of his rallies, I can tell you, and the inauguration, that it's extremely effective, that people like it, that they like how direct he is, and they like when he says tough, which he said today several times about how tough we have to be. These tough phone calls in which he yelled at the Australian Prime Minister. You know, he said, we have to be tough. You know, we have to get the world together. That's what we need to do. We have to be tough. So I think after an attack, you will see that happen. And that's what frightens me the most when we talk about his moves towards autocratic power, which, you know, I think are very possible. It's not like it'll happen overnight, but it's very possible. And I have to say also, just adding to your point about his populism, we don't know yet in what his populism actually consists when it comes to policies in office. For example, the biggest example, his program of public works. Will he indeed want to, as his consigliere Steve Bannon says he wants to, spend $1 trillion building roads, schools, airports, bridges, and so on? Will he do that? You'd say,
the question is also, how will he do it? Will it be a privatized
that's true
boondoggle for companies, or will it be a real public works project?
Yeah, that's true. That's true too, and that's important in the politics of it, because the Republicans are going to do the latter, what you just suggested. They're willing to do that, to do it with tax breaks and basically selling the roads that are built to the private sector. They're quite willing to do that. Make it private, you know, private toll roads from now on. But it seems to me that if he wants to establish something on the level that Bannon has said he wants, he's going to need Democratic votes. And his populism, I mean, that will be an interesting evolution of his politics if he is able to, in fact, step away from the Republican Party and actually use Democratic votes to get something like this established. I have no idea whether that's possible, but in a funny way, it's even more frightening, because it will that will actually be a way to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. He'd actually be successful.
No, I mean, the need to improve the infrastructure is there, but you do point out, rightly so, that one of the amazing things is the incredible hypocrisy of the Republican Party, which reveals, I believe, the not so hidden resentment and, I would say, racism against Barack Obama. First of all, on the executive order question, which they were completely, you know, went on and on and on, and that's all that he's done so far. The failure, the collapse of any kind of fiscal conservatism. And so it is interesting that the Republican Party is faced with a variety of revelations of their own inconsistency and hypocrisy. And of course, the terrible, cynical embrace of the of the far evangelical right. One of the hallmarks of a functioning democracy has always been a clear separation of church and state, a respect for religion, but respect for religion as a private matter. And so the lifting of the Johnson Amendment, the vowing to somehow give the anti-abortion movement its success that has been denied them. It seems to me that I would agree with you that if he actually put in a public works program, which is a much needed thing, although it somehow doesn't include public schools, it includes the privatization of schools, that he could turn out to be very popular. And I will be proven wrong that a movement can't be created by a 70-year-old. And who knows, he can run for a second term. So I do think that the real question facing the Democrats is how to deal, for example, the current court nominee. So the current court nominee, from the available choices, is really not as bad as it might have been. Both Nixon and Bush and Reagan nominated worse justices as nominees. But on the other hand, having so humiliated the past president, who chose absolutely a conservative Democrat nominee, he did not choose a known civil libertarian. He didn't choose William O. Douglas. He chose a centrist justice to be nominated, and the failure to respect that privilege and to leave the seat vacant. What do the Democrats do? How much do they cooperate? What do you think? Should they cooperate? Should they resist? Or should they pick and choose?
I think they should resist, without a doubt. You know, we should say about this that our politics before Trump were showing rather dramatic signs of decadence. The threat in 2013 to default on the debt, the leaving of the Supreme Court seat open for the first time in history for 10.5 months. These are signs of a kind of breakdown, systemic breakdown in how the system is supposed to work. And I think actually the Democrats have a little bit of blame for this because they essentially assumed, I have to infer that President Obama didn't fight as hard as he might have on the Merrick Garland issue because he assumed, like everybody assumed, that Hillary Clinton would win and Garland would indeed take his seat on the court. And my view, while that was going on, as those 10 months slowly passed, was that he should have appointed him and seated him. And essentially should have said, for the first time in history, the Senate is not acting on a legal Supreme Court nomination. They have the advise and consent privilege. They have 60 days to start hearings. And if they don't, he'll take his seat. And I think it was a very bad mistake that they essentially let this happen because they thought that they were going to win at the polls. But I think that the Democrats should resist. I think they should filibuster. I think the consequence may well be that the filibuster is just the so-called nuclear option. Washington loves phrases like that. The filibuster will be presumably removed, and he will take his seat anyway, or maybe not. Who knows? Maybe there will be a fight about it, and Mitch McConnell will make some kind of compromise. Who knows? But I think there's some times when you get rolled and you have to respond. You have to respond. And I think in this case, the Democrats, on this really important matter that has to do with the separation of powers and how the system works in a very fundamental way, I think they have to resist. And I think that actually the demonstrations that both Leon and I are heartened by are having their effect slowly on the Democratic Party representatives and senators in Washington. You're starting to see something of a backbone. I saw someone brought a spine to a hearing. Was that for Chuck Schumer? They carried a spine and said, "Chuck, here's your spine," which I thought I was grateful for that. So you're starting to see a little bit of movement on the Democratic side. And I think this is, there are times politically to stand up and be counted. And one of those times is when one of the parties to the system starts changing the rules, gets in power and starts changing the rules. And that, in effect, even before Trump, is what the Republican Party has done. And with Trump, they are really doing it. We'll see. We mentioned the judges' stays when it came to the Muslim ban. I wonder if those are going to survive or if Trump is going to win that fight in court. I think it's quite possible he will win because the president has very broad powers in these matters.
Yeah, but there are aspects of it which clearly will be argued to be unconstitutional, both in matters of substance and process. I also think a lot of what you say depends on which voices are heard. So it's interesting to me that there is not yet a serious religious voice from the Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish communities that is in the public eye in opposition to what is going on. My hope is that the ex-president will have a very brief retirement and will enter the public arena as a voice of reason and of justice. But we need voices that are more than crowds. We need people beyond the Rachel Maddows, and because everybody watches the television program you like. How many of you spend hours watching the program you don't like? We've been attacked by Breitbart. Bart has in years past, so we are familiar with them. I don't watch them voluntarily, read them voluntarily. And so we do have a communications problem. We don't have the central networks. Somebody, I think it was silly, most people in the audience are too young to know who Walter Cronkite was. I'm
not so sure.
I'm not sure, Walter Cronkite, right. Which of course is ironic because his name means illness in German. But having said that, there was this notion that we got behind our proverbial television sets with our TV dinners. There are too many people who don't even know what a TV dinner was. And I never ate one. But anyway, you watch a television and you had one person telling you the news. And if you switched to ABC and NBC, it was more or less the same news. And there was some journalistic seriousness. I'm amazed by the number of errata in the New York Times every day. The wrong day, the wrong first name. No wonder you don't believe what you read in the newspaper. But what's interesting is that, so the question is, even with that failure, there is a shortage of civic voices that are heard, both among communities of faith that are not on the far fundamentalist level, people beyond Hollywood, and calling Trump names is no good, and attacking his son is no good, and making fun of the first family is no good, just as the enormous dignity of the Obama family did us no good. It's irrelevant and shouldn't be that. There is so much to attack about Trump by what he says and what he does that one doesn't have to attack his character. One can analyze his character. One doesn't have to stoop to the level of vulgarity that he has established. We're not going to beat him at his own game.
I agree with everything you just said, and it was very eloquently put. But there is, it seems to me, something of a contradiction, which is that we are all trapped in Donald Trump's personality at the moment. I mean, it really is the case. Have you ever been sitting in a bar and someone comes in and starts talking to you next to you or sitting in an airport or wherever, and they're so neurotic, it's as if you can see into their skull. Do you know what I mean? Their insecurities and this is a strange person you meet. And Donald Trump really is on that level of strange that to see him in any public setting is to become part of his personal narrative in a uncomfortably intimate way. It's one of the reasons why his rallies were so fascinating and so mesmerizing, that you become part of his story, this incredibly strange personality with this gargantuan narcissism, which is, on the one hand, easy to understand, but on the other hand, continually shocking and fascinating because it seems so ridiculous. And now it belongs to the personality of the most famous person in the country, in the world, you know, to the leader of the country. And so it's very hard, I think, to separate with this president above any. I don't know who you could compare him to, LBJ, but it's very hard to separate his personality from his policies, because in a sense his policies are his personality. I mean,
yeah, but you're absolutely right, and that's why one has to focus not on denigrating but opposing. In other words, you're absolutely right. He can control the argument if you play it on his terms, and he can be obviously. That's why he was successful. How many of you watched this Apprentice show? How many of you ever watched a Donald Trump TV show? I never have, but
for my sins, I had to watch a lot of them when I wrote about him.
And certainly I mean, I've never been attracted to Donald Trump's largely because of the overriding vulgarity of it. So it's just aesthetically undigestible. I always thought that there was something about his self-presentation was unelectable, even before he opened his mouth. That there was something, you know, the same with his hotels.
But it is the cartoonish character.
It is a
appeals
caricature
to people. He is, in a funny way, the American cartoon. You know, he is a cartoon of American excess.
But something
he has
said,
gold-plated seatbelts on his plane.
Yeah,
and gold bathroom appointments on his plane.
I want to turn you back to something you said, which is really the right point. How do we oppose that? How do we oppose that? Because, you know, I hate to make this analogy, but there was nobody easier to caricature than the European fascists of the 20s. You know, Mussolini, Franco, they seemed ridiculous. They seemed vulgar. They seemed illiterate. I mean, if you watch the reels of the speech making, and so the elites of which we are part were horrified and felt superior, and that's something we can't afford to do. We can't afford to take that position, but I don't think we can fight them with the same tools.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you know, it should be said, we have done that. That is, we have felt superior. We have, you know, the elite of the country, the people in those crowds who said to me about polls, bullshit, it's like everything the press says. You know, they were saying it's like everything the elite says. And the great satisfaction in seeing his election was in part to, you know, épater les élites, you know, to shock and appall the elite, the satisfaction of that. I think some number, it's something in the high 30s, the percentage of Donald Trump voters who told pollsters they didn't think he was fit to be president. So something like more than a third of his voters did not believe he was fit to be president, which to me is a fascinating thing. That, in other words, he was a way of sending a message.
But that message, I think you're right, but that message is largely a white message. My own theory of that is that what particularly galled the people who felt abandoned by the government and by all of us who lived in the red states, who lost their jobs, who saw the traditional industries moving, is that they had this image of the rising prominence and distinction of people of color, who became the President of the United States, and judges, and doctors, and lawyers, and corporate executives, while they seem to be sinking away, and this white resentment. So I think, yes, there was a lot of voting for Donald Trump, which was simply to put, to sort of derail the train.
Yeah, and I think you were right earlier when you said, you know, the responses, obviously, the Democratic Party, I mean, this is a whole other discussion, but the Democratic Party sold its soul to globalization, and this was the impression, and it was the right impression, in particular in the so-called Rust Belt states. Now, it's the effect of trade is much exaggerated in the problem. We could obviously,
technology is much more of a factor.
Absolutely the case. But the fact is that Clinton, you know, old enough to remember the politics of Clinton, who, when he came to power, it was thought that a Democrat would never win the White House again, you know, that it wouldn't be possible. And indeed, he won 43% when he came to power in '92. And he rejuvenated the Democratic Party partly by pulling it into the center and cozying it up to Wall Street. And, you know, in a sense, his wife bore the brunt of the resentment that his politics caused. There's no question about that.
So I think probably we'll turn the floor over to you. Who are the microphone bearers? Okay. We have one?
The runners.
Oh, runners. Who's the Great. So why don't you position yourself in the aisle and raise your hand. Who would like to start? The gentleman over there. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for the talk. When Ramsey Orta came to speak here last semester, afterwards a student came up and said something akin to, I don't want to be cooped up in a library studying while important things are happening out in the world. And I think that a lot of us feel like we're at a critical moment in history, and there's an anxiety that to stay in school studying something like Proust would constitute, you know, tacit consent to what's going on in the world, which is not something that I necessarily agree with. But I'm just curious, particularly President Botstein, what you would say to somebody who says, well, I want to drop out and go do something out in the world in order to protect the future from Donald Trump.
So it's a wonderful question, and I'll tell you what I told the faculty yesterday at the first faculty meeting. And I would also refer you to a piece that's coming out in the New York Review of Books, a review of 2 books written about the prison program at Bard, one by Daniel Karpowitz and the other by Ellen Lagerman. And when you read that piece, you'll find the answer in the person who wrote about that. And I would pose the question to your fellow undergraduates who are in prison and ask them, what should you do? So what I told the faculty is, precisely because of the politics of Donald Trump, the best resistance you can do is to deepen your education and to put forward the value of education. It is literature, the arts, the conduct of science and research, which will be the last stronghold of freedom. It'll be the last defense. And your being in college and taking advantage of your education and being able to express yourself, to command the language and the traditions of learning is the best protection I as a citizen have. The more the citizens out there have confidence in their reason, in their own judgment, in the power of learning, the safer we will be. The largest differential in the election was between uneducated whites and educated whites, those with more than a high school education. You can serve your country best by getting an education. And there is not a single incarcerated undergraduate who would disagree with that statement. I think what our faculty are doing, and in every serious place of higher learning, is so much more important because we are finally the bearers and the protectors of human freedom and of a capacity to dissent and to reason and to discover the next way in which we can improve the human condition. So you will do no one any good. Once upon a time, you could say this is an ivory tower and it's irrelevant. Proust is irrelevant. But memory is crucial. Our memory of oppression, poverty, disease is a crucial motivator to eliminate those things. Our memory of forgotten voices. If it were not for the research of the Academy, our understanding of the African American history, the new museum that went up in Washington would not have been possible. And if it were not for artists, especially in authoritarian countries, as we move under a kind of what you called soft autocracy, the voice of the arts and of people who are articulate are, in the end of the day, a rescue. That is, after all, the elites that brought communism down in Eastern Europe.
I should add to that that if you want to take an action against Donald Trump, read Frederick Douglass. Yeah, and also, you know, don't be hard on Proust. Proust would really be appalled by Donald Trump.
Because one thing we have to do in opposition is to paint a picture to people who are dissatisfied, legitimately dissatisfied, of how things could be better. For example, Obamacare. Obamacare was a bad compromise, better than nothing. But it wasn't national health insurance. It really didn't improve medical care. It didn't reach everybody. It didn't solve the problem of the abuse of costs. It didn't do. So, but in order to figure out how public health should be done, right, you have to know something about it. It can't be done the way Donald Trump talks. If you want to employ people, and how are we going to deal with all the population that's going to be displaced by, for example, the driverless car? And the driverless truck, and the automation, and the robots. How are we going to respond? We are increasingly a knowledge society. How are we going to talk with the people we don't understand? We teach Arabic. Maybe you'll change your program. I don't want to say anything against Proust, but maybe you'll change your program. And maybe it would be time to learn Arabic and Chinese, and learn things maybe that are different because of your own circumstance. Not the arts, I would say, but in subject matter. So if we're going to make a better place, we have to know how to do it. And it's not simply common sense, not seat of the pants. The number of underemployed or unemployed people without skills is too great already. Don't add yourself to that group. And also, I would say, in this article in the New York Review of Books, the guy took a swipe at how easy we are on undergraduates, not Bard, but American colleges. They go to class 12 hours a week, and there was some statistic as only a minority of American undergraduates actually do the reading that they're assigned. Of course, Bard doesn't have that problem, but you have plenty of time to be politically active. Your schoolwork doesn't get in the way. You're only in school 30 weeks a year, and you're not in a boot camp. We didn't wake you up at 6 o'clock in the morning and you fall into your bed exhausted at the end of the day. There's plenty of time to be politically active. And I don't want to raise this specter, but the students of the 60s demonstrated that very ably.
Hi. Over winter break, I had a job where a lot of my coworkers were, at least in part, Trump supporters. And it was really interesting being in that environment the last couple of weeks and talking about politics a lot. And I found that while sometimes it was really frightening to hear those views articulated, there was also a lot of communication that was really positive that I didn't expect. But the number one thing that disrailed any conversation was not agreeing on what was a legitimate source of information. And whenever I cited something like the New York Times or NPR or CNN, just immediately the conversation derailed and it became a conversation about how biased those sources are and how it's, the Clinton news network. And so I guess and that's why it's so disturbing to me to see the way Trump talks about the press and the way he subverts having a free and legitimate press. So I guess my question to you is, do you think that communicating across that gap is valuable? And if so, how to do that?
Well, I think it's unquestionably valuable. There's no question about that. You know, I'm urging people all the time to watch Fox News and to watch other sources of news. It's important to do it. I do it. Leon said he didn't voluntarily read Breitbart. I don't know if that means he involuntarily does, but I think it's important. Fox News at the moment is just very revealing. And, you know, to me, reporting on the election, for example, is this process of being inundated or being isolated in this different world. And the world is wholly non-contradictory. You know, everything hangs together. It simply doesn't touch the world of liberal coastal thinking at all. So I think the derailing phenomenon you're talking about, I'm very familiar with it. But I think one thing to do is, if people would read a little bit or look a little bit at the coverage of the other side, I think it's enormously useful, not least because, you know, Fox News occasionally gets things right. There are some parts of his politics that are valuable to hear about, not least what we talked about a moment ago, the hollowing out of the so-called Rust Belt manufacturing areas. There is a lot to talk about, and I think that kind of communication is extremely necessary. And I think, you know, one of the sad things here is that we can take our seats on the stage and talk as if this is one large family group whose political views we generally know, right? We can, as your question was couched in the same way, we all assume about our politics that they're basically the same. And I think that's, you know, that's very sad. I teach at Berkeley too, and you know, it's very unusual that I have anybody of a conservative temperament in my classroom, which I think is a pity.
So I think it's a wonderful question, and my advice is, and to all and each and every one of you, is to, in a friendly way, to break bread with people who don't agree with you. In this community in Dutchess County, which voted for Trump, to go, whether it's in a church or in a club, or to sit down with people who don't agree with you, and with empathy, not to moralize against them, not to look down upon them. I was once invited to the Conference of Christian Universities in Oklahoma City, and first of all, I questioned why did they invite me, and then I figured they really wanted to take a close look at a Jewish liberal from New York. I think I was a zoological specimen, and I arrived in this huge auditorium filled by faculty and staff from universities in whose membership you had to sign on to a creed. Oklahoma Baptist University, a bunch of mostly Protestant, all Protestant evangelical institutions. And I realized I was facing a crowd, and my job was, I said to them when I started, if you're looking to realize a cliched picture, I won't disappoint you. Even my appearance fits, you know? But then I realized my job was to empathetically understand why they believed the world was the way it was. And once I gained that trust, I could begin to encourage them, once they trusted me, not to have contempt for them, not to think they were ridiculous, not to trivialize their sense of being born again, their effort to reconcile computer mathematics with revelation, that this was not a waste of time or dumb, that we have to be better at going across what we don't believe in and listening to them and respecting, and then try in exchange to explain why freedom is good for them, why due process of law is good for them, why non-religious discrimination is good for them, why the separation of church and state is good for them, why the Bill of Rights does matter, why X, Y, begin to have a conversation which at least leads them to agree to disagree, as opposed to be aggressively combative. You follow me? And we don't do that. We don't do that. We avoid people we don't agree with. We don't feel welcome. But we need to do much more of that than we do now, because ignorance, not evil, is ignorance and illusions are a kind of narcotic which has successfully led him into office, not evil itself. The young woman here, yeah. That's you, yeah.
Thank you for the very wonderful discussion. And I am a East Asian Studies student at BAR, and I want to ask a very specific question about Asian areas. I read an article about the Trump administration just exists the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and this agreement is used to against China's economic. And Trump seems to be create a tense relationship between China and arose the problem of Taiwan. And I was a little concerned about what directions or what future attitudes Trump administration will present in the China or the East Asia area.
The question was about Trump's policy with respect to China and East Asia?
Yeah, the future direction or attitude.
Future direction. Well, you're quite right that Trump the other day formally pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade deal that was probably dead anyway, but that I think had Clinton won, probably would have been signed with some changes. Trump accused her of that, and I think he was quite right that she probably would have signed it. It's true that that agreement was, even though Trump during the campaign seemed to think that it was an agreement with China, in at least a couple of Republican debates, he seemed to have no idea what it was. In fact, that agreement was about firming up the United States alliances and relationships with other major trading countries in Asia to the exclusion of China. It was part of what the Obama administration called the pivot to Asia. That is that U.S. foreign policy is too much occupied with regions that are actually ancillary to American interests, notably the Middle East, and that it should be concentrating on the fastest growing region of the world, which is Asia, and the major problem there is trying to limit the influence of China. So that was the rationale. It does seem, Trump has broken, it's been 2 weeks and we forget about, these kind of huge controversies that were 10 days ago. He did have a telephone call with the head of state of Taiwan. That broke all precedent since the late 70s. The United States, since the era of Kissinger and Nixon, has had a so-called one China policy. That is recognizing that Taiwan and the People's Republic of China are somehow one. We're not going to say how they're one, but they're one. And he seems to be breaking with that and with the idea of using Taiwan as a bargaining chip in trying to come to different trade agreements with the Chinese, and also to try to resolve disputes in the South China Sea, where China has been very aggressive in building up islands on contested areas of the South China Sea. This represents a very dramatic break from what was going on during, not only during the Obama administration, but the Bush administration before it, indeed for the last 40 years. It seems to go along with his general philosophy, which is leverage, deals. We need to make new deals where, the Chinese are so smart, they're have made great deals and we haven't. He's convinced that all our trading agreements were signed by stupid people, as he put it eloquently, and people who didn't know what they're doing, and that he's going to try it all again. Having said all that, if he goes forward on this path, it will be a kind of revolutionary approach to our relationships in Asia. And the irony is that if he's going to get tough with China, his first step has been an enormous boon to the Chinese, which is killing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was the major part of the policy of trying to pivot to Asia and isolate China. So as in many other areas, he's dramatically inconsistent. I mean, his policies seem dramatically contradictory at a level that is almost impossible to understand. I mean, presumably Rex Tillerson, who's just been approved as Secretary of State, will have to try to sort this out. But I think the idea that he can use Taiwan as leverage with the Chinese is a completely ill-founded idea. To them, this is absolutely central to their existence. They are not going to bargain over this, I think.
I second what Mark says. In addition, I have two worries. One is that I hope that his posturing doesn't put the Taiwanese people in danger. That is to say, it's not only what happens to us, but also to the Taiwanese. The second is that I have a great regard for the Chinese because they always play a long game. And Donald Trump is in a short game. And they view American democracy as, if they look at it in the long term, Donald Trump may be just a blip. So for them to be aggressively reactive is not likely to be their case. I think the Chinese are extremely thoughtful in long-range planning. Their initiatives have very long horizons. So this is a disturbance which they're going to try to, as Mark suggested, they got a windfall out of it, actually. And if he continues to annoy the Australians, he'll get even more of a windfall as the Australians get closer to the Chinese in trade. So in a way, China can afford to wait. China is not vulnerable, and therefore it actually probably is a stabilizing force. In addition, I think in his mind, hard to say that. In the illusion that he trades with, he believes that there is some kind of alliance that he can forge between Russia and America against China. That's totally fiction. Yeah. Total fiction. It's not going to happen. So it is, I think the Chinese are in a game where they can stay the course and wait it out.
Yeah, I really agree, and I'd add to that, they've had a number of windfalls that have just fallen into their lap, as the Russians have, courtesy of Trump. Xi Jinping went to Davos and basically posed for pictures as the new leader of the world, as America withdraws, and also the Philippine relationship is now much
Putin
closer.
walked into Hungary in a triumphant mood as the new patron of Europe.
It should be said that the other thing is related to what Leon said earlier about the people around him and how competent they are. I'm talking about Trump. Tillerson said in his confirmation hearings a rather offhand remark, well, I don't think we will let the Chinese, have access to those islands anymore. As if you could just send in the Seventh Fleet and prevent them from getting to the islands without there being a military confrontation. And if there was such a confrontation, I think you'd have a similar situation to what happened after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is, would send China on a much more dramatic upward course in building up its armaments and its military presence.
The Chinese are not a threat to us by any means, but what I do fear is that if he keeps this up, that it could put Taiwan in particular in harm's way, and that's not desirable. Yeah.
What are we supposed to do about the irreducible sort of pickle of the Democrats are about making government work and Republicans are about proving that it can't work? So the game is fixed for the Republicans because they obstruct, and they prove their point. So I mean, this is not necessarily a Trump problem, but he just puts his own gloss on it. But it's certainly going on for the last 8 years, and it's going to continue. And how do we get out of that sort of spiral?
Well, it's a very good point. You know, it's a fascinating thing that the Republicans, even when they're in power, have the energy of an opposition, because they feel still, even when they hold government power, that the permanent bureaucracy remains against them, the elite media remain against them, the cultural entertainment complex remains against them. So they have, I mean, it's a great thing for a political movement to feel like it's always in opposition, because it gives them a great deal of organizing energy. And it's been something that's used to its great benefit by the Republican Party, certainly, you know, since the early 70s, I'd say. So I think you're right in your basic analysis. Having said that, they have it now. They have it. I mean, they are in power. They have 52 votes in the Senate. They have an overwhelming majority in the House. They have the White House. And they, in fact, have to deliver results to their constituencies. And, you know, the interesting example I would point you toward is Obamacare, which Leon talked about a little while ago. For 6 years, 5 years, they have vowed to repeal and replace Obamacare. Repeal and replace Obamacare, repeal and replace Obamacare. They've had, I think, 40 votes in the House to repeal it. Well, suddenly they're in power, and in fact, Obamacare insures 20 million or 23 million, depending on the estimates, Americans. Very, very large number, that's a very large number of people. And insofar as bringing insurance to people who didn't have it, it's been an extremely successful program. Now, they've said repeal and replace, repeal and replace. You know, I went to various rallies of Donald Trump where the second or third thing he would say was, Obamacare, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. What a disaster. I'll tell you what, we are going to get you all great health care for half the price. Great health care for half the price. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. And he would say this at rally after rally after rally. And now it's fascinating to me, and one of the more interesting things to watch, to see them try to deal with this promise. Because in fact, there is no way to give great health care to all those people at half the price. There is no way to do that. And the idea that, well, they haven't figured out the plan to replace it yet. They haven't figured out the plan to replace it. There is no plan to replace it. It's not as if you can suddenly insure 23 million people, but without Obamacare. I mean, you know, we can argue about reducing divisions at the borders of the states and various other little ideas they have, but to actually insure all those people is not an easy thing to do. Donald Trump has said he wants to keep having health care, being able to stay on your parents' health care until you're 26, and also the not refusing coverage because of pre-existing conditions. At the same time, he wants to remove the mandate. Well, guess what? You can't do both of those things. If you take away the mandate for health care and require insurance companies to cover anybody, even somebody who's sick, a lot of people, millions of people, will not get health insurance until they're sick. That's why you have a mandate. And so these contradictions, they now have to cope with in some way, and you're seeing them trying to cope with it. And one of the consequences is, no, they did not repeal it on the first day. I'll argue they're not going to repeal it in the first month. I don't know what they're going to do, but they are actually in the position of having to deal with the responsibility of governing. And I think so. I think the idea that they just want to tear government down is not, at this point, going to prove to be true. They're going to have to do something on health care, and Trump is going to have to deliver. You know, he made some very basic promises, one of which was to bring back coal, bring back steel, bring back good jobs. Very simple promises. He is going to have to show results for those promises somehow. Either that or he's going to have to get the country into a war or something else. So I think it's going to be fascinating watching them actually try to govern.
If I may say, in response to that, it's interesting. I think Mark is too optimistic. I think they can deflect the responsibility of their own failure onto states, onto somebody else, as you suggest, also change the issue. There's an irony here. He could do it by having public option, a single-payer public option, but he also has now the opposition of the insurance companies, all of whom have adjusted and made money adapting to Obamacare. So getting out of this. But what you add, which is very, very perceptive, is that they have had so much energy on the resentment of the public to the inefficiencies of government. We all face it. The fact is, the reason they've had such momentum is they've had a vision on their side. Their vision is the world would be better off if there were no government, and the less government, the better. So when 1,000 people oppose him in the State Department, they're get rid of the 1,000 people. You don't want to work for us? We'll have no. Now, the interesting thing is the American public, in some weird, perverted individualism, believes that life is possible without government. And what we who oppose Trump have never successfully, in my memory, put forward is a vision about government being your ally, not your enemy. The idea that government is going to sue me, it's going to take my taxes, it's going to lose my driver's license, it's going to overcharge me, it's going to, that government is something to fear and to resent. And we do not have an opposition that has, that's what's wrong with the campaign. They campaigned against Trump. They didn't campaign for a vision of how the public could serve the people.
But it's interesting that Obamacare itself is a great example of that, that the administration, the Obama administration, I would argue, completely failed in conveying what the program was, why it was important.
They bungled its rollout.
They bungled its rollout, but they also, you know, it's a great conundrum of President Obama that he was so good and eloquent in giving set speeches, but that the administration itself was rather terrible in its communication skills, I would argue. I mean, the idea that it's even conceivable that you could repeal Obamacare now when it's covering so many people is insane. And it's part of a testament to the fact that they failed to communicate clearly what it was.
We live with a 40 years since really Nixon was a transition figure. But with the arrival of Ronald Reagan, we have come to embrace the myth without a real resistance. First, they were called socialists or something like that. People who said, what it took at the Great Depression to convince Americans that government could help them. And then took a war to make it real. You know, in the 50s, the sort of halcyon days of white American Mad Men shows, you know, there was a progressive income tax, much higher than people pay now. The idea no one wants to pay taxes. And Trump won by saying, I'm a smart guy, I didn't pay any taxes. Elect him. And so it's perverse. And we have to find a way to persuade people, A, that they can't live without government, that their life would be worse with government, but we have an obligation to make government work better. Who works for government? The young gentleman who said he should stay in college. Do we really wish for our children to go to college and become civil servants? Do we admire that? Do we ever go to a baptism and say, I hope my son grows up to be an elementary school teacher? We don't say that. You know, so we ourselves have to find a way to fight the merely destructive. Get rid of that, get rid of this, get rid of this. this complex society is not governable without government as a sympathetic, competent, helpful agency, and not an over-papered legal waste of time, although I don't mind full employment, but they get in our way. We run a small business here at Bard. I'm no fan of government regulation. Government is, in a way, a pest, an expensive pest. But on the other hand, be against government is wrong. You have to make government work better, and that we don't have a persuasive argument.
Two quick points. I forget who the political scientist, the name of the political scientist, who did a famous study in the mid-'70s that essentially concluded that the American people are ideologically conservative and operationally liberal, which is to say they, love Medicare, they love Social Security, that in fact these things are, it is not possible to remove these things. These are valuable programs that are recognized as such, but they will be often ideologically denounced. I also should add that the person who can make that case for government, who's very good at it, is Elizabeth Warren, who has, yeah.
And Jerry Brown.
And Jerry Brown, too, that's true. But so it can be done. It can be done.
Woman in the middle, yes.
My question is, what about Mike Pence? You've mentioned Kellyanne and Bannon and Kushner, but where does Mike Pence fit in all of this?
What about Mike Pence? Well, Mike Pence is was a very, very conservative congressman, way over on the right, a very conservative governor of Indiana, with good contacts within the Congress, including the so-called Freedom Caucus of Tea Party-ist types. So he's a much more ideological figure than Trump is. Trump's very heterodox ideologically, quite heterodox, but Pence very far to the right and also has a lot of contacts, and it seems to me is having a very strong influence on the administration because, as Leon said at the beginning, they didn't really, Trump didn't have a gang of people to come into office with him, and Pence, it seems to me, is very influential in staffing the government. So he's putting a very strong, very right-wing stamp on things. It also means if you're dreaming of impeachment, if that's what you dream about at night before you go to bed, just remember, President Pence. President Pence.
I think there are two things about Pence that I see from a distance. One, I agree totally with Mark, that he's ideologically much more coherent, and he's also has served as a governor. My fear is that he should not be the major beneficiary of a Trump failure. And as you suggest, it shouldn't. The other good news is that he does not have anything near the charisma that Trump or the media savvy. How much influence he has is, I'm not we're now the same way we used to be in the Soviet era of looking at Kremlinology. There was a whole science of academics, looking at tea leaves of who says what and who's got the lever. I have no idea whether what influence he has on Trump. The woman in the very back, we're going to quit exactly at 9, so let's try to make this rapid, and the very energetic gentleman will be next. Yeah.
So in light of all the nationalistic, isolationist rhetoric Trump is putting forth, and like you mentioned, Xi Jinping saying in Switzerland that essentially he's willing to take over, if America were replaced globally by China or any other nation in its economic and political significance, how would someone like Trump, who's addicted to fame and attention, react to a sudden lack of interest from other nations in what America is doing, if that were actually accomplished?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that Trump, whatever he does, will always find a way to be the center of attention. And I think the United States, whatever he does, is not going to lose its place on the world stage quite that rapidly. I think he believes, getting a bit more deeply into the premises of your question, he believes that the United States can still be the dominant nation because he's all about dominance. You could call his politics dominance politics. Remember what he did to Jeb Bush, low energy Jeb. It's all about dominance and being at the center of things. And I think he believes that the United States, once it sheds these kind of irritating alliances that suck the lifeblood and the money out of the United States, that it'll be all the stronger for that. So I think he still thinks he'll be the center of things, and the United States will.
It's interesting because this whole selling that America is no longer great and was great, that's the whole premise, is not backed up by facts. So that's a little bit of a problem. So he does face the possibility that unemployment will rise and the economic well-being, limited as it may have been to certain populations that he inherited, will deteriorate. I also think another way of answering your question, it's a good one, we have an obligation. We're not powerless. This is the time for America to show what it is outside of government, what Americans stand for. The gentleman asked about the studying, for example, what American writers, thinkers, scientists, business people, what we would call the ordinary American thinks that's apart from the government. That the greatness of America doesn't lie purely in its military or its economic power. But I agree with Mark that we're not likely to be so easily made a minor figure. Although I do think the only place where I think permanent rifts that he might create, that might change the dynamics, I worry a lot about Mexico, a lot about Mexico, because I think this is undoing tremendous, almost a century of effort to try to deal properly with the very distinguished, significant, and admirable neighbor to the south, whose government is a little bit of a failed state. And this idea of military, going back to the early 19th century or to the days of Pancho Villa and tried with military, I mean, that is terribly frightening. And it's also contemptuous of the Mexicans, which angers me deeply. And the other is that we may actually force the Europeans. I worry about the eastern corridor of Europe that fears the Russians and the Baltic states and the former Eastern Europe. And the sort of Trumpism looks like a license to Putin to reinsert himself in a kind of proto-Soviet way in what he considers his sphere of influence. That is to me the most present danger in the foreign policy area. The gentleman. Yeah. And I think you will be the last question. You've been terribly kind to come out on a cold night and sit through this conversation. Both Mark and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So earlier you brought up you were looking for Christian and Jewish religious opposition to Donald Trump. And so you also later talked about the Christian universities that you encountered, and you seem to have presupposed a conservatism in the institutions.
I didn't hear the last part.
Sorry, it seems like you assumed a conservatism in the institutions by the way that you set up the question or the discussion. And so my thought is that I've been noticing increasingly a lot of Christians that I know are have this sense that the left is hostile to Christianity, that the left is un-Christian, and so I think it's a strange phenomena. I think that you can find some extremely economically liberal themes in the New Testament, and so I was wondering how you think the left can open up to the idea of Christianity as something that isn't a threat to liberal ideology.
So I'll have Mark have the last word on this one. This is what I think. I think that we have to abandon those of us who are, let's say, agnostics or not Christian or atheists, have to abandon any contempt for people of faith as a premise, to abandon what was a kind of early 20th century belief that the world was headed for secularism and rationalism without any superstition or belief systems. That's number one. Number two, that so what we have to do is to make the claim that whether it's a belief in science or the belief in justice or a liberal world order is not incompatible with being deeply religious. The second is that we are hamstrung by the collapse of any charismatic tradition of liberal Christianity. 50 years ago, you could name the great liberal theologians. They started with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, with Karl Barth, with Paul Tillich, Reinhold Niebuhr, great figures that represented what we would call a tradition of liberal Christianity, both at home here, that goes back to the generation of Emerson and Thoreau, and that was an admirable public force. And that has collapsed. The traditional churches have lost ground. So in all religions, in Jewish religions, in Islam, and in Christianity, the reductive fundamentalism has captured the desire in a complex world to have simple truths. And we feel that in the Jewish religion as well. There are no figures like Buber or Heschel in the center or in a liberal sense. And so my hope is that this crisis will galvanize in Protestant and Catholic communities. The Pope is the beginning of some hope of a new set of religious leaders who can actually broker this conversation between a pluralist liberal society and the pursuit of faith. The problem with theocracies is something, and what I object to the extreme left in the United States is that they've taken on a mode of puritanical absolutism, not dissimilar from the extreme right. You know what I mean? And so I think that's part of the explanation. I would look for some revival in the traditions of liberal Christianity.
Yeah, well, I thought that was a very good summary of where we are. I mean, we need Reinhold Niebuhr. You know, we need some of these figures. Not only were they extraordinary writers and intellectuals, but the intellectual world of which we are a part would have been able to tick those names off as easily as Leon just did. And they simply have no counterpart today.
Martin Luther King.
Yeah, they have no counterpart. But of course, just raising Martin Luther King's name and mentioning the civil rights struggle, the anti-Vietnam War struggle, is to remind us that, you know, there's a very strong tradition of politics of faith on the left, very strong, that accomplished great things in the 60s and 70s. And I think, you know, I join Leon in what he said, that we need those sorts of figures again. We certainly need to eliminate this kind of, if you could call it a kind of secular exclusionism, insofar as, I mean, I think to some degree that's perceived, to some degree it's real. I know in the March on Washington, for example, there was a great deal of controversy because certain leaders of anti-abortion groups were essentially, I don't know whether they were excluded from the leadership of the march. I believe I have that right. And I thought that was a mistake. I don't know very much about it, and maybe if I knew much about it, it would be a more complicated issue. But to me, it seemed very much a mistake, that what you want to do now is broaden your coalition to include very much people of faith, and people who have strong beliefs, whether they're expressed in a secular or a religious way, about, for example, the tradition of this country in welcoming people, in welcoming the poor, in welcoming the homeless. You know, Donald Trump, it seems to me, is trying at bottom to alter the idea of what our country is. He's trying to change it, what it stands for and what it is. And we like to think about it in the best light as a kind of, you know, Reagan often used the phrase city on a hill, a beacon. This goes back to the Puritans, a welcoming place for people around the world and so on. These are secular notions and religious notions at the same time, which is why they're so powerful. And I think that increasingly the left and the moderate left has to use those notions and use it to battle this kind of attempted hijacking of the country, which is what I think of it. You know, when I look at the Muslim ban, you know, the phrase that Obama used to use so frequently, it really annoyed me, frankly, but I think back at it somewhat fondly now, was that's not who we are. That's not who we are. And it seems to me that increasingly the opposition needs to use that notion and that perception in challenging its audience to remember who we are. And that's both religious and secular.
And the good news on an optimistic closing note, just as I suggested that a dictatorship has never been created by a 70-year-old, the demography is against him, because what Mark correctly identifies, eloquently identifies, is a nativist image of America as white and not diverse. And the fact is the numbers, and closed, and the numbers of people in this country. Really, we are responsible for his election because almost half of Americans didn't vote who were eligible to vote. A high percentage of them maybe were prevented, but if everyone who could have gone to vote did vote, he wouldn't be president. So the fact remains that we need to wake up and to realize that he speaks about an America which, in the actual numbers of the people are here, much more closely represent what the Statue of Liberty represents than his rhetoric. And we need to take heart in that, because in that sense, not only because of his age, but because of the demography of the nation, in the end, I believe time is on our side, but only if we actually keep our voices heard consistently and resolutely, and do not fall back into passivity and tacit tolerance. I want to thank you all for coming, and thank Mark for participating.